Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although, actually not. It's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
And welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am your host, Tylor, who knows these books and loves these books, and we are now onto the 8th of these books that I know and love. And I am joined by Greg, who knows half of these books and loves about a third of the books so far, maybe. I don't know that exact number. Greg, how are you feeling about starting yet another book in the Wheel of Time?
Well, you know me, I love throwing more fuel to the fire. In other words, I'm Prologue. Go ahead.
Wow. That was an introduction. I want to start our discussion tonight because it is a relatively short reading. It's only 3 POVs. I suspect we're not going to have an hour and a half of discussion tonight. I'm really curious about how you are feeling about the next several books, because you had mentioned something that I hadn't really thought of with the Wheel of Time earlier in the previous book, and I kind of wanted to wait until we were in a transition to talk about it. You had mentioned the Wheel of Time in terms of a 3-act structure, which I think is an appropriate way to think of things, but it's not the lens I had put on the Wheel of Time, mostly because, 14 isn't easily divisible into 3s, and so you have to include the prologue to make it work, and that's weird. It's bizarre, right? But I like that way of thinking about things because it's a new thought on where are the big turning points in this series. So if we're thinking of this as a 15-book series, which is fudging just a little bit, we are maybe a book or two away from the end of Act 2. And so I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are. What's coming in that next 1,200 pages that brings us to the end of the Act 2 of this giant meta story that Robert Jordan is telling?
Well, so I would say, kind of in broad strokes, the goal of Act 1 would be first just pure exposition. You have to introduce a bunch of people, and then you have to introduce a set of problems that they will then try to solve. And so if we took that, I mean, I agree with you. I don't really know how to put the prologue in that. But if we took that as Eye of the World...
It's a prequel. I'm sorry I said prologue again, but either word basically means it, yeah.
So that would mean we would take the Eye of the World, the Great Hunt, Dragon Reborn, the Shadow Rises, and Fires of Heaven. And I would probably throw Lord of Chaos into that, right?
I think that's totally reasonable. Yeah,
that's
my debate. Is it those 6, or is Act 1 through the Shadow Rising, and then we say the Fires of Heaven kind of starts Act 2? I could see either of those breaks, but that seems about right.
Well, and so in the traditional Act 2, it would be all the plans they made to solve those problems go wrong and things get way messier. And I think that very much speaks to a Crown of Swords and
this is where I think Lord of Chaos would fit better in the Act 2 structure, right? Demise Wells is everything explodes.
Yeah. So take that as the end of Act 1. That makes sense. So just this would then be book 2 of Act 2. And I can't speak to how well this one fits in, but, that did feel like last time, that Crown of Swords is just kind of dealing with more messiness. I think a little bit about Lord of the Rings and how when you start the Two Towers, you're like, hey, Rohirrim exists. Get emotionally invested in this world. And there's a little of that going on too, right? We're expanding out and we're adding new kingdoms and characters. And so that might also pull it back a little bit into Lord of Chaos a little bit. It's a messy.
Yeah,
I
think
Fires of Heaven and then Lord of Chaos.
that is correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's right. It's not a perfect structure, I think in part because Robert Jordan probably intended this to be a trilogy, and then eventually it became 14 books, and so his definition of what was Act 1 probably shifted in the middle of this storytelling, right? It grew on him. But I was kind of thinking about that a lot, in particular, because of one of my favorite jokes on, I think it's Arrested Development, but maybe it's another show that has blended into Arrested Development. But someone's talking about writing a screenplay, and I think it might be Ron Howard. And the advice they give after hearing absolutely zero of the, information about the script is, buddy, if you got Act 3 problems, you got Act 1 problems. And I think that A, is really funny, and B, gets me because I had never thought about the relationship between the acts in that way. And as I think about that in terms of Robert Jordan, Act 1 is not my favorite if it includes books 1, 2, and 3, but I think it lays the groundwork really well for what comes later. As you say, we get hints of even things like the Shan that don't show up again until book 7, but we kind of do seem to get all of the problems sprinkled throughout those early books. So if that's true, what do you think is coming in the next book and a half that kind of caps off the disaster piece that often is Act 2 for our main characters?
I would just in passing, I was thinking too about Game of Thrones, and that I would liken my experience of reading these early Robert Jordan books as similar to reading George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones, which again, who knows? But he says it's 7 books long. We don't know. So if you compare,
for what it's worth, Robert Jordan said that the last book would be the last book, no debate. And then Brandon Sanderson looked at it and was like, no, this is 3 books. So authors can be wrong.
So, I mean, if that ended up being true, then that would be like the first 2 to 3 Game of Thrones would be kind of somewhere in there, the act break. And I see a very similar pattern of introducing more and more problems. And in that one, for me, it was always like they introduced the White Walkers, I think, immediately in the first book, or pretty quick.
Very early.
And then it's like all this other stuff happens and you get so invested and you're like, oh, were there still zombies up there? And the show, I think, showed why that was faulty and kind of reimagined that. And the White Walkers were much more present kind of throughout. So what am I thinking? I think it's going to get a little messier still. I think the prologue kind of hinted at some of that still, that we still have some factions and some new parts of the map to explore and fill in and get in the mix. I do think there were a lot of names I wasn't supposed to know in these chapters, as opposed to names I don't know but should know. And so it feels like we're still kind of expanding. I also think Act 2 is a time when main characters get separated and end up working at cross purposes, only to kind of settle those scores between each other. And I feel like that seems partially what we're in for the next couple books, is that our kind of core characters have ended up on different sides of things. And so a little bit of like Nynaeve and Elaine not really working with Matt, and then they settled it and they're kind of working together now. I mean, it's not perfect, but all these ways in which, it feels like we're going to have those types of conflicts before we can get into that last stretch of everybody's working together to get to the final battle.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so kind of more strife and division between characters that we've so far thought of as working in lockstep seems like a very interesting prediction. And I think that's a good place to lead us into the prologue, Deceptive Appearances. And we didn't discuss this, Greg, but I'm going to do my summary by POV so I don't pass out at the end of it. Etheniel rides through the Black Hills thinking that they are more like mountains. She has 50 of her best men with her and has been avoiding notice by any of the nearby villages because she worries that if they are spotted, their mission will be for naught. The queen, which is Etheniel, asks if she made the right choice, and one of her counselors says all of the other choices were even worse, and as she does, the White Tower is paralyzed and broken, and so they must act because no one else is going to. At this point, Baldair, one of the other individuals with her, says that he dislikes hiding who he is, and Atheniel seems dismayed when Balder orders a watch despite the fact that they are only meeting with allies and no one else knows that they are there. Atheniel then thinks that Rand has much to answer for, and she sees the ruins of a previous age as she approaches the meeting place. At the meeting place, there is the king of Arafel and also the king of Shinar named Isar. Their companions are also there, including Agelmar Jagad, who we have learned in the past is one of the great generals. Their exchange seems tense and worried because they worry that any of the others have been seen. One of the advisors warns that they are leaving the Blight unguarded, and they worry that their actions will be seen as treason either by Rand or by the White Tower. They briefly debate turning back when Tenobia of Saldea arrives, saying that if she needs to go alone, she will, because she needs to find out what happened with Bashir joining Rand instead of capturing the false dragon, whose name is escaping me, Mazrim Tame, there it is. Atheniel then thinks Tenobia will never be wed, and so the crown will pass to Davram. Pater then says he has brought his Aes Sedai advisor, and with her 7 Aes Sedai visitors that were along at the time. Tenobia then says that she has 5 more Aes Sedai, meaning that there are 13 total. Atheniel worries about secrecy even more now that they have 13 Aes Sedai, and Isar says it may be good to have 13 Aes Sedai once they get to the south. Tenobia tries to fix up Atheniel with her uncle, and she considers this and then says that they will do what they came for, and they all cut their hands and then swear by blood and soil to work as one in their quest. But we don't get to know what that is. So this is a really interesting part of the prologue if you can figure out who is being talked about by the end of it, and the answer is the kings or queens of all 4 of the Borderlands. What do you take away from this?
Well, I guess maybe I should have saved my Game of Thrones talk. It felt a lot like talking about Game of Thrones in the wall, and how the wall is being kind of not guarded as it once was, and how there's a threat beyond the wall. But interesting to me that we are in a part of the map we have visited back in book 1 in the very start of book 2.
Yeah, 1 and 2, yeah.
Yeah. And that it's, it's like, oh yeah, the Blight is up there, and they're used to Trollocs kind of coming across in kind of raids, and that it's quiet. But now that we have, this little cabal that is going to seemingly work to try to take down Rand, right?
That's what it sounds like. Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a scene that is intentionally cryptic, but all of the hints are pointing at all of them being like, well, someone's going to think we're traitors, and it's either going to be Rand or the White Tower. And those sound like 2 groups you don't want to piss off if you're fighting the Blight for a living. So they're up to something. We don't know the details, but after Rand feels like the number 1 candidate at the end of this chapter.
Well, and so, again, as always, just to acknowledge that trans people are people and have full rights. But then it reminded me a lot of the start of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, where you kind of get this dark, gloomy scene where Snape and Draco's mom, whose name I'm forgetting, something Malfoy.
Yeah, that one.
They make an unbreakable bond, which we didn't know existed until that moment. It's that Snape will...
If we didn't know it existed until that moment is the Harry Potter just phrase of the day for the past 100 years. Go ahead.
But it's Snape averring that he will help Draco complete his mission, and we don't quite know what the mission is. And then later over the course of that book, we learn that he has to kill Dumbledore, right? And so it felt very much structured like that to me. I'm like, okay, we get all these characters who are doing this blood oath, which I don't think has like a magical dimension, but it certainly has like a cultural significance that this is, beyond a vow of honor, and that they are going to then act to do whatever they can to keep this. So that to me is a ploy an author uses to set a ticking time bomb, right? Yeah. And I assume, as it's in the prologue, I assume we will see the result by the end of the book. They will shoot their shot, whatever it ends up looking like.
Greg, it's worth noting, still has not learned that when you predict something will end at the end of one book, you haven't learned how Robert Jordan works. I can't promise this won't end at the end of the book, but every time you've said that before, 4 books later, the thing comes to pass. I don't have much about the early part of this chapter. I do think it's really interesting that we get yet another reference to like a ruin from the Age of Legends, and this is probably the most clearly a skyscraper description that we've gotten so far in these books, which I think is telling. It feels like Robert Jordan is maybe not being quite as mysterious about some of that world building as he was before. And then the other piece here that I had in the early portion of the chapter is it feels like this chapter almost wants you to be struggling to figure out which name goes with which kingdom and to be flipping back and forth to your map. I don't know if that's effective, but I definitely found myself like spending time piecing it together in a way I usually don't have to, even when there are scenes with lots of people I don't know.
Well, and remind me, and listeners, I texted Tylor excitedly thinking we had a new map, and I don't know that we did. I need to go do my comparison, but I think they shifted it so that the crease in the pages comes at a different part.
That would
but
make sense.
That might be wrong. But like Ebou Dar is like right in the crease, and that's essentially where the line goes up, which puts Saldia, which gets name checked here, also on the crease. So it all felt to me like you had extra empty space to the left side of Falm, like that all had that shifted.
Got it.
But
yeah,
I haven't verified this, so as a there. Can you just help me remember when Saldia came up? I started thinking about Fail.
that's exactly correct. And in fact,
Okay.
my next note is a new thing that we learn in this chapter. So we know that Fail is from Saldia. We know that Fail's father, Davram Bashir, who is now one of Rand's generals, just helped him capture Ilion. He is from Saldia and was originally sent to capture Mazrim Taim. We also know that he is related to the queen, but we didn't know up until this point exactly how closely related. We learn in this chapter, Tenobia, if she does not have a child, her heir would be Davram, meaning that his heir would be Fail and presumably Perrin. And that is all happening under the kind of story we get here is that Tenobia is so picky, it seems unlikely she will ever wed. And so it seems like unknowingly Perrin has more or less married into the line of succession of Saldia.
Which would potentially fulfill some of those prophecies you asked me about last episode with
Wolf
different
King and things
flags
like that,
and stuff and so on. So, okay. And Davram is working currently for Rand. So if the kingdom passed to him first for some amount of time, then that would be just another one in Rand's pocket, seemingly. And then probably more interestingly would be if he was killed in service of Rand, then it went immediately to Fail, who, you know, I would characterize Perrin and Fail as soft allies at the moment. Like they're working for that, but it doesn't seem like they're really like dyed in the wool for the cause.
Well, and I don't want to make any predictions because I'm the one who knows whether these predictions are right or wrong, but just to put words in your mouth, just a little bit ago, you were talking about people who had previously been allies, their alliances cracking. Well, Fail might not be as soft of an ally to Rand, or might be not an ally at all to Rand if her allegiance suddenly switches to Saldia primarily. And so I think there's the possibility both for, as you're saying, an advantage to Rand if there's a change in who rules this country, but also potentially a schism that could be created between some of these main characters. So it's definitely worth watching. And I think the other thing to keep an eye on related to that is Tenobia, the queen of Saldia, basically outright says, I don't care if the rest of you go, I'm going to go and find out what Davram is up to. And so that kind of putting Rand at odds with the kingdom that it had previously seemed like was more or less in his pocket, I think is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
And that is exactly the kind of thing I meant by things getting messier, right?
Yeah.
That we have, you know, more people, more players on the board, and then like more scrutiny of those relationships. So it all seems very likely me. The other thing, maybe this is misplaced, but the other reaction I had to this first POV was just I was waiting to be able to say called it, because one of the things I threw out offhandedly last episode was like, land will be very important, and his heritage that he could. And so it felt like the fact that we were now kind of focused back up on that region felt that way. But I think I'm correct in saying there was no hint that like nobody was like, if only the lost king could come unite us all or anything like that. So I would say that's still in play, but I certainly can't say I predicted it at this time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think my read on that would be something like, if Lan's kingdom was still there, Lan would have been the 5th member of this council. But it doesn't seem like anyone is like lamenting that they cannot complete their mission because of the lost 5th kingdom or something along those lines. I think the only other note I had here is that a group of people coming to deal with Rand, it seems like, is a problem. A group of people with 13 Aes Sedai coming to deal with Rand is both more of a danger and isn't going to have Rand in any way predisposed to take a peaceful path, given the way that Aes Sedai have treated him recently. Any kind of final thoughts on the future of this plot line, given that we now have 13 Aes Sedai, which is a dangerous number?
Well, yeah, it just feels like they're gonna get nowhere close to Rand. I guess my only other question about is we should assume these are 13 Aes Sedai loyal to the tower.
I think that's probably right, just given that they all seem to be working with one another and that at least some of them are advisors who predate the schism. So I think that's a pretty good assumption, although not necessarily true, because I think some of them are referred to as having arrived recently. So it could possibly be like a split delegation like we saw in Ebou Dar, where both sides are represented, although probably the exile tower in a much smaller number.
Cool, that's helpful.
Awesome. Unless you have any further thoughts about the kings and queens of the North, I think it is time that we then jump into Verin's POV. To anyone listening at home, I don't know when we're recording, but the Queen of the North is not a reference to Game of Thrones. It's a reference to Drake May's wife. Go Patriots. We're going to the Super Bowl. Let's now talk about Verin's POV. Verin shields Tirana, who can barely sit up, and she looks around at the Aiel camp. Verin spots Coirin wearing black and performing useless labor, and the wise ones made sure that Verin saw this, and Cerelia apparently asked Verin what shames wetlanders the most, and Verin now has a list that is tailored to the individuals that the Aiel are trying to break. Verin asked 2 Aiel to report that she is done with Tirana, and she would now like to meet with Caderin. She spots Irgrain, one of the stilled Aes Sedai, and Tirana then says there is no hope, and Verin says there is always a way. She eventually soothes Tirana a little until 2 wise ones and a man enter and take Tirana away. Verin thinks that Cadsuan is cause for concern, and she thinks that Cadsuan is dangerous. One of the wise ones then grabs her book of notes, but it's all about plants, and Verin thinks that there is a cipher that is necessary to decipher what it is really about. Verin then promises to learn more about the Aes Sedai's plans by interrogating the individuals as she has been doing. Verin remembers when Erin, which is annoying, threatened her if she stepped out of line, and then the maidens bring in Beldine, who did not have warders, and so she doesn't make a good fit for what Verin is supposedly studying, but Verin is then told that Caderin escaped. Verin seems furious that she hasn't been told about this, especially because Caderin is of the Red Aja and so could threaten Rand, but the Aiel say that several wise ones were poisoned and they're trying to keep it quiet. Verin is told to watch her tone around wise ones, and she is told not to tell Rand about Caderin. Once the wise ones are gone, Verin offers to heal Beldine, who calls her a traitor for working with the Aiel and teaching them channeling, particularly the ability to make a circle. At this point, Verin says that Beldine has been digging in the sun and could use healing. Beldine notes all of her belongings were taken away, and at this point, Verin explains what Datsang means among the Aiel, and Verin thinks that a man complimented her smile once, but it was the last thing she saw, or the last thing he saw, as Verin smiles at Beldine. Verin then says they will find ways to shame her until she breaks, even if it takes the rest of her life. Beldine almost seems defeated by this, but then insists that she will be rescued or escaped, but Verin says this isn't possible because the Ashaman can be brought to bring her back at any time. Verin then thinks that Beldine is ready and begins to channel through an Angriel, and she begins a complex weave. Beldine says that she doesn't know if any of the Aes Sedai support Rand, and Beldine then defends her actions before Dumai's Wells, saying that it was all at Galena's orders. At this point, Verin keeps Beldine talking while she is weaving her complex weave, and Beldine says that Rand had to be kept safe. Verin's weave finally completes, and she thinks that it isn't quite compulsion, but it is close. She begins to give instructions, which she knows will only be followed if there is no suspicion of her, which she thinks means that this technique generally doesn't work on men. Beldine then reacts as if she had fainted, and Verin says that she is done with Beldine, and she begins to feel exhausted because of all the channeling. She thinks that she needs to keep Rand alive until it is time for him to die. And you may have been tipped off to the fact that Verin was a little shady because I said it 800 times, but if you hadn't been tipped off before, boy would you be after this chapter. What are your take on Verin's POV here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was already scrutinizing her a little bit, but I found myself really struggling this time because, like, everything she does here is pretty dark and terrible. Yeah. And then it's like, but I still got my guy. So there's a streak of it that still feels a little like Suan and Moraine, which is, yes, we'll help Rand, but only because we have to get to his certain time and deal with it then. So, like, I think she says it more directly than the other two ever did, but it certainly is not like he's a good guy and I need to help him. It's much more, I have my own purposes here.
And it is worth noting here, in this chapter, I do not believe Verin lies. But given the amount of darkness she is doing, and the fact that, like, 5 books ago we had a debate, did Moraine lie or did Verin lie, I'm kind of coming down on the side of Verin might be able to lie, which suggests she may be of the Black Aja, or at least she seems evil enough for that to be in the cards potentially, right? And so I think that's the thing, is we're both like, she seems really bad here. I might be worried about whether she's of the Black Aja, but you're right. At the end of this chapter, she sounds exactly the same as Moraine and Suan did 5 books ago. And so it's kind of hard to dismiss her as still potentially being a force for, like, if not good, at least neutral, which is better than we can say of most Black Aja. I want to start at the beginning, which is mostly Verin observing the Aiel and the way that they are treating the Aes Sedai. And the thing that I think is most interesting to me is that the Wise Ones are starting to adapt the way that their punishments work. In the last book, we saw a lot of the Aes Sedai being punished like Aiel, and it almost felt like bizarre, like the Aes Sedai didn't care about the punishment. And now the Wise Ones changing the way they punish these women, I think is having a really significant impact on the Aes Sedai they're punishing. And I think it signals something really important about the Aiel, who prior to this had been a really, really kind of tradition-driven culture.
Well, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't get a little lost still in Aiel things. And so, you know, we get a lot. Well, I guess I would characterize this chapter as a lot of the Aiel traditions being mixed in to Verin's world, right? I don't know that I'm struggling with words there because I don't think I'd call Verin's world Aes Sedai tradition at the moment. Fair. Like, it's more like just kind of basic administration seeming around this camp and around these forces. And so the fact that it's now also like, you know, mixing in some of those concepts from the Aiel, but they do seem to be pretty together in their purposes, right? Yeah. And when they're, you know, there's obviously the big moment where they say the Wise Ones have lost some to poisoning, but they're trying to keep that quiet. And it's not like Verin's like, great, I can expose that and get a foot up with, or a hand up with Rand. It's like, no, it's like, okay, then we keep that quiet and we kind of manage that.
Yeah, and I know that keeping Aes Sedai straight is not your forte, not because of you, but just because it's your first time reading these books, and no one keeps Aes Sedai straight the first time. I do want to note, the Aes Sedai who escaped from the camp is Caderin el-Ruddin. We have had a POV from Caderin el-Ruddin's perspective in the past. That POV actually revealed that Caderin has been a member of the Black Aja for the past decade. So when we hear that there have been poisonings and one of the Aes Sedai escaped and we know she's Black Aja, that immediately suggests to me that there are also dark friends among the Aiel who might have been the ones who broke her out.
And that is interesting too, if they would be just dark friends, which is what you said, or potentially if like Black Aja could also involve people like wise ones, right?
Yeah.
Like that seems possible, that if it's a sect of people who can channel, of women who can channel, then why wouldn't they have invaded that piece of this continent as well. I think I won't pretend I had grokked that myself, but I do think it's to me it just felt like understanding there's a pretty wide conspiracy at work here, and as again in that kind of second act way, as Rand starts to control more and more, he's going to miss more and more, and it gets messier and messier. I'm hearing Princess Leia in my head, right? The more you tighten your fists, the more star systems will slip through your fingers, and just feels like he has to rely on allies like seemingly Verin, and it's gonna get messy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Actually, there's one moment before this that I do want to make sure we zero in on, because this is a chapter, or at least a section of a chapter, that I think is designed to make us doubt Verin, to worry about whether she's evil and whether she has the right things in mind, and to not think of her as necessarily being one of the gang, even though she's kind of in the gang at this point. That being said, she has a strong reaction to Cadsuan. She thinks of Cadsuan as being unexpected and dangerous and someone to be monitored and possibly even removed from the situation. And I can't decide internally whether that makes me think Cadsuan is a good person because the bad person Verin wants to get rid of her, or whether it might mean that Cadsuan is actually dangerous just in general, not necessarily in a good way or an evil way, and so we should be more worried about Cadsuan than we had been. We've been thinking about, is she of the Black Aja maybe? Are we worried about her kind of goals? But this also feels like a reaction from an Aes Sedai who we think of as very logical, seemingly like afraid of this woman.
I don't think I would have put that in as extreme terms as you just did. It felt little to me, not meaning any disrespect to the dead, but it felt to me like John McCain's reputation more than his actual actions.
Okay, yeah.
Where he always presented himself as, I'm a maverick and I am going to not side with my party. I'm going to be an independent rogue and stand up for my values. And so it felt to me like Verin was kind of painting Cadsuan with that brush. It's like, here's like an older member who you can't rely on to play the game the way we all would want them to play the game, right? They're not going to necessarily follow the side. They're going to just follow their own values. And so I leaned into the age piece just because, again, we have had this said that she's been around a really, really long time, right?
She is the oldest Aes Sedai by at least a decade.
So that to me means that, like, unreliable in terms of caring about kind of with that longer view of history. She would not care about the kind of vicissitudes of any random moments here.
And it might be really worth keeping that in mind as we kind of continue to observe Cadsuan, because if that's the way Verin's thinking about her, then we might start thinking, how is she acting differently from other Aes Sedai? Because I think they do really have a method of negotiation and acting that Cadsuan may very well disregard. I think that's a really great observation. I then want to note the fact that the Wise Ones are concealing Caterin Elrond's escape from Rand. And I was not expecting this chapter to make me doubt the Wise Ones, who up to this point had arguably been Rand's closest allies, who I would have expected to give him the most of all of the information they had.
Yeah, I don't know if it really made me question them entirely. It's more like, if we haven't gotten like a Knights of the Round Table scene, but it's like, if all of Rand's factions are at a table trying to do the most they can for them, then they would absolutely want to hide the fact that they have a major weakness and have made a big mistake. And Rand is not the kind of leader who seems like he's gonna Darth Vader force choke them for a mistake like this, right? But it does feel like if you want to continue to be of the most use, you hide the mistake. So it felt more like that than a conspiracy to work against Rand's will or some such.
Yeah, I think that makes a reasonable amount of sense. I don't have as much to say about the second half of this chapter, largely because it is Verin kind of admitting internally she doesn't care what Beldine is talking about. But it seems like the primary goal of what Verin is doing is to kind of break down Beldine emotionally. It's to get her worried and then scared and then nervous and kind of bouncing around all these negative emotions. And we've seen Verin kind of as like the doddering professor type in a lot of scenes, just kind of in the background, like jumping in with the one thing you need to know from 500 years ago. And so seeing her kind of manipulative in this way felt very different from anything we had seen from Verin before.
Felt very cat with a caught mouse, right? Just kind of
Yeah.
playing with her in some ways. So yeah, I would agree. Feels different. I, you know, I don't like this Verin person more, but I like her in terms of like this feels way more interesting and
Yeah.
like something to really spark some new different types of conflict. So I was excited by her presence here, even if that means, you know, I'm just a messy bitch who loves the drama.
So I am very curious then. It seems like we're ending this chapter basically saying Verin seems much darker than we had thought before. We are thinking of her maybe as a candidate for the Black Aja, or if not, at least like a rogue Aes Sedai who doesn't seem to be playing by the rules the others are. And it seems like she is interested in something about what is going on with the other Aes Sedai who have been captured, and she's giving them secret instructions. I'm curious, what are your hypotheses or guesses or just outright headcanons? Like, what do you think is going on with Verin right now? Where do you expect this plot to go in the next 100 to 10,000 pages?
So this felt to me more like a deep tease, and I
Okay,
think the reason it's here is that we won't get a Verin POV anytime soon, and then when she's wandering through scenes, we have to play the guessing game of why is she doing that and is that actually helpful? And the other piece is just that at least for the time being, she's going to keep Rand alive, right? And
Yeah.
we don't know exactly what that moment is she's envisioning. Again, it didn't feel totally different than like, I have to get him to the last battle. It
Yeah.
just may be that she wants him to lose the last battle. Or again, maybe she's in the employ of a Forsaken who wants to be the one to take him before the Dark One or something like that. So,
well, and it's worth noting, at least one Forsaken has in the past planned, let's not kill Rand, let's get him on the dark side, or let's team up with him.
Yeah.
And so there are sides other than light and dark in this battle, but Verin certainly doesn't feel as firmly on the light as we had previously put her.
and I want to see more. But again, I mean, that's not a prediction that we won't be around Rand or Verin. I just don't think we'll get to be in her head because that seems to be
Yeah.
a pattern. Like, yes, I want to reveal to you that this is why she is acting this way, but now you're going to have to guess at what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting this is probably the fourth Verin POV in the series, despite the fact that she's been in it since the beginning of book 2. So I think it's very rare we get in her head, and probably will become even more rare now that Robert Jordan is giving away details like he is in this section of the prologue. Any last thoughts on Verin? I don't really have much to say about Beldine here. She chats for a little bit and then gets some almost compulsion done on her. Anything else before we jump into Moridin's POV?
I will just say good section of prologue, right? Like, again, the pattern seems to be, let's just make sure everybody's aware there's some shadier big picture stuff going on before we get into kind of the minutia of each of these plot lines. So effective. Both sections so far have been very effective. And I don't know, let's talk about the third.
Which is less effective. Moridin sits in a room that seems to defy physics. He plays an ancient game that begins, he says, when a particular piece is captured, and the goal of the game is to hold on to that piece called the Fissure, but not to play it on an opponent's square, or you can eliminate your opponent entirely, but that never seems to work out well for him. He holds 2 mind traps, and then he thinks that the Fissure in the game is always depicted as a man with a bandage over his eyes and a wound on his side, and Moridin then realizes that the Fissure is likely modeled after a past version of Rand and crushes a goblet in his hand. Moridin thinks it is hard to lose a game when you play both sides and seems pleased by that revelation. So hey, there's a metaphor here, Greg. You like those. You read Moby Dick or whatever.
Yeah, it seems fun. I mean, the one thing that was on my mind, I won't call this a pithy observation, but you had asked in our wrap up of book 7, like, what about the kind of Tom of it all in the older generation? And so when you're talking about the Game of Stones, which this appears to be a more ancient form of, then it just feels like we're thinking about Tom and Morgaze and you know, that generation more. So but yeah, I think you're right that it's mostly on a symbolic level. He's going to play the 2 sides and find his way forward.
I do just quickly want to note, however, there is one thing to note that I think is easy to miss here, which is that the fact that Moridin says only 9 others know how to play this game makes me think that he is either a Forsaken Reborn or someone else who made it from the Age of Legends like the Forsaken did, right? It doesn't seem like this is setting us up for Moridin as like a truly new player from this age.
Helpful.
Other than that, I just think it's kind of cool the idea that Rand, in a past turn of the wheel, had such an influence that he became a piece in a game. We know the bandage on his side and the wound. He's now been wounded there twice, but a bandage over his eyes is something we've only seen in Prophecy before. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that symbolism, because it's all I can ask you about.
I was just laughing to myself that you would think the best path through life is to be immortalized in a game someday. But
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, we just had our episode where we went through the prophecies, and I was remembering how many times we talked about eyes, but it's not always Rand, right?
It's Matt also. Matt has eyes on scale and bloody eyes,
right.
and Rand has a bandage over his eyes.
And the other person I was thinking of just because I'm always thinking about him, is Neo from The Matrix, right? Where the later
I
phases...
was expecting a Wheel of Time character. That got me.
So, yeah, it just made me think, in the later stages of the original Matrix trilogy, he starts to wear a bandage over his eyes. And it's kind of common chosen one mythology type things. And, the wound on the side is obviously very Christ-like. And, you think about Justice and other figures that get blinded for the way to see a greater truth is to be blinded. So all that was in my mind, but it's exciting. Again, I don't really have a read on Moridin, but I'm intrigued and I'm interested. I am walking away from our conversation tonight, right now. Goodbye. No, because I'm walking away thinking a little bit more about how you've noted there are a few references here to the Age of Legends, and so maybe we're really going to start to get some of those answers. That would also be an Act 2 move, right? And you would potentially be building to that kind of cliffhanger into Act 3, where it might be that we finally get kind of the full picture of what this mythology is, so that the last act can be our characters really dealing with that. Now, I'm not predicting that for this book, because Act 2 might be another book or two long, so we'll get there.
Fair. I do want to quickly note, we are going to be doing 2 chapters next week. I did not write them down, so let me turn to the table of contents in my book.
Chapter 1, to keep the bargain, and Chapter 2, the unweaving.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I do want to note, next week is a little on the long side, but nothing special. The week after is pretty typical. After that, this book just is frustrating. There are longer chapters than the previous books. It tends to be long chapters after long chapters. Do expect us to probably have some longer weeks going forward, in particular the next 5-6 weeks. I think there's going to be quite a few long weeks in there. But because of that, this book is only going to be 4 months long in our normal 1 week per episode format. So make sure that you are ready to go. Make sure that if it's going to take you a little time to get the next book, you start looking for it, because this one is going to vanish in a flash. So, Greg, any last thoughts on the beginning of this book before you go upstairs and read what I suspect may actually cause us to have an ill-advised discussion of visual media in the 2nd episode of a season?
Oof. Not really. It's been a long time since I threw in a plug, so I will just throw in a plug that my movie podcast, which is called The Long Take Review, which I'm a co-host on. We are deep in the middle of Oscar season whenever we might happen to be recording this. So we have some really fun episodes out, but if you're somebody who's been, watching a lot of the awards movies, we have reviews up of most everything that got nominated. I think we missed 2 best picture nominees, and so we're gonna loop around. I mean, Train Dreams just came out on Netflix. We didn't think it was a big deal, but we got to go back and find that one. And I think we also have to do Secret Agent too, even though we've all seen it. So but if that's of interest to people, if you want to hear me talk in a way that is slightly more knowledgeable than I talk on this show, then please seek me out there. But if Dummy Greg is the Greg brand you like, then join us next time through the glass columns.
Dummy Greg is my favorite brand of Greg.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.